Hi y'all! I've got my reading glasses on because in this video I'm going to talk about books. Now I know it might be a big surprise for some of y'all watching this that I know how to read, but I actually like to read. I read more nonfiction than fiction for some reason. I don't know why. Are some fiction books that I've enjoyed over the years, but really I like to read nonfiction more than anything. In this video, I'm going to be talking about my 5 favorite Appalachian themed books. Now, Appalachian themed books are one of my favorites along with Southern Gothic, and I think that's because there's so much reality or realism in them that they almost are nonfiction, if that makes sense. Some of the books I'm going to talk about in this video, even though they are works of fiction, they could very easily be true stories. Now, these are not in any particular order as far as one being a favorite or anything like that. So let's get started. The first book on my list is Icy Sparks by Gwen Rubio. It was written in 1998, but it is set in the 1950s in Eastern Kentucky. It's about a little girl named Icy Sparks who has Tourette syndrome. Now, in 1950s Eastern Kentucky, Tourette syndrome was not something a lot of people were familiar with, and that plays out in the pages of the book. She has severe tics, Icy does, and her grandparents kind of get on her for it. They're suspicious of it, because nobody really knows what's going on with her. So in order to hide her tics from her grandparents, whom she lives with, she goes into the cellar, and that's where she kind of gets her tics and things out of her system. People treat her differently, of course, because of her condition. And the book is a lot about, overcoming these kinds of things, especially through faith. Icy really has a big turnaround. There's a lot of bad things happen to her, and I don't want to give away too much in any of these books, but she has a big turnaround when she's taken to a tent revival. And she notes to herself that people who have gotten the Holy Spirit kind of act like they have Tourette's. And that gave her a spiritual rebirth. It allowed her to move forward. Icy Sparks is a really, really good book. It was part of Oprah's book club back in the day, and it's won several awards. So it's a really good one to check out, especially if you're into Eastern Kentucky literature or anything to do with people overcoming adversity. The second book on my list can be a little controversial, and I think you have to take it with a grain of salt when you read it. It's called Night Comes to the Cumberlands by Harriet Caudle. It was published in 1963. And it tells the story of the poverty in Appalachia, especially Eastern Kentucky, that we seem to be stereotyped by. It explains how things got to be the way they are. There's a lot of discussion of the coal mining and logging industries, broad form deeds, how land was taken, the Union wars, everything to deal with it. It's written very textbookish. From what I remember, Caudle, the man who wrote it, was an attorney, and it's written like someone who was an attorney. But it's a really good book. It's a good exploration of the way things are with economics in Eastern Kentucky. But at the same time, to me at least, he has kind of a condescending approach to some of it. And to me, that kind of takes some points away because, I don't... Tell me what's going on. I don't need your opinion about it. I'm grown. I can make up my own. But it is a very interesting read, especially when you read it with the lens of how it was written and who wrote it and why. The third book on my list is called River of Earth, and it's by a pretty famous Appalachian author named James Steele. It was published in 1940, not too long after The Grapes of Wrath, which is going to come up again here in a minute. The book is about the Baldridge family, and mainly the patriarch. He's big on dignity and self-respect, but he's also big on being generous and helping others. And this is set during the Great Depression, so there's a lot of want and a lot of hunger and things in Eastern Kentucky while this is going on, and he's always there to provide for people, even when people are taking advantage of him. He has family members who live with him, and it's obvious they don't like him. The only reason they're living with him is to take advantage of his generosity. There are strangers who come by at one point and ask if they can have something to eat, and he tells them, go pick something from the garden. When he goes back and look, they destroyed the garden and took everything. And so one of the things that runs through this is How far do you go in being generous when you know someone is taking advantage of your generosity? Are you still a good person if you're being generous, but you figure out that they're taking advantage of you and you cut them off? Where's the line? Now, another theme that runs through this book is whether or not to work in the mines. And the Baldridge family are pretty self sustaining. You know, they raise their own food, they take care of themselves, that kind of thing. But there's always this kind of desire or need for more. And they can have more if he goes and works in the mines. But, you know, mine work is dangerous. They really don't get paid what they probably should back then or today, you know? So there's that issue of, are you a more dignified person if you provide for yourself or if you work for someone else and they're the one providing and you actually have more than if you were working for yourself? It's a weird dichotomy. So the next book on this list might be my favorite, but it's also a difficult read. Not that it's complicated wording or anything like that. It's a tough story, and that's The Doll Maker by Harriet Simpson Arrow, and it was published in 1954. The story takes place during World War II in eastern Kentucky, and the main character is Gertie, and it's about Gertie and her family. And Gertie whittles. She whittles. That's her skill. She's a big time whittler, and she can make anything from spoons, axe handles, you know, whatever you need that's made out of wood, she can whittle it. Her favorite thing to do is to carve dolls, and she's very, very good at it. At one point, the family decides to up and leave for Detroit. You know, there was a great migration from Appalachia during World War II. People went north to work in the factories to try to find a better life. A lot of cities had what they called Little Kentucky, a neighborhood that was hillbillies, you know, that gathered up there and lived together. But when they get to Detroit, they find out, you know, there is no promised land there. And things, in my opinion, things got worse than if they just stayed home, not to give too much away. Gertie had always been very faithful to her Christian beliefs, and that gets questioned a lot once they move to Detroit because of some of the things that happens. She has one piece of wood that she's been hanging on to forever, and because she's always thought one day I'll carve Jesus in that piece of wood. And she begins making her dolls and selling them in Detroit, and it gets to a point that she has no wood. They're going to have food, and she has to use that wood to carve dolls and sell for money. So really, it's a book about sacrifice. They sacrificed giving up everything they had at home in the mountains to move to Detroit for what was not a better life. She had to sacrifice that last piece of wood that she was going to carve into a Jesus. It's a very interesting story about sacrifice. If you ever watch the made-for-TV movie, and it is available, that's a hard movie to watch sometimes, especially if you're from here and you know people that have gone through similar things. It's a rough one. And my final book on this list is the most recently published, and it's the only one on the list that takes place in the present day, and that's Clay's Quilt by Silas House, and it was published in 2001. Silas House actually lives here in Berea. He's from Laurel County, which is about 40 miles south of here, and he lives here now and teaches at Berea College. It's about a man named Clay who don't have a lot of opportunities in his life. He's a pretty wild feller. He likes to drink and he likes the ladies and they do drugs and that kind of thing. Him and his best friend Cake, I think was his name. And part of Clay's problem is when he was 4 years old, he saw his mom get murdered. And his mom was a pretty wild woman too. She had her own little reputation, not a little reputation either. Everybody kind of knew. She was just, as country people say, she's an old rip. That's what they call her. But the story is about not letting circumstances control you or your direction in life and coming to terms with the things you've done and your past in order to move forward and have a better future. There's 2 or 3 times he gets opportunities to do this, and it's all symbolized by a quilt. His uncle is a very talented quilter, and he makes Clay a quilt from his deceased mom's clothes as kind of a reminder you need to come to terms with your past before you're ever going to get anywhere. It's a very, very good book. It's a pretty accurate description of present day Appalachia and around here, some things that go on, especially when drugs get involved. And since the opioid epidemic and meth and things, this story echoed similar stories that I've heard in real life. And that made it really interesting to me. So that's a look at my 5 favorite Appalachian themed books. Like I said, one is nonfiction and the rest of them really could be nonfiction in parts. It seems like all Appalachian books have themes of religion and your faith, overcoming things and having to make sacrifice. That's a thread that runs through pretty much any kind of literature that's set in the mountains down here. And it's interesting because it's very true to life. I hope you enjoyed this one. And if you have a favorite Appalachian themed book that I did not mention, tell me about it in the comments. I'd love to check it out because, like I said, this is one of my favorite things to read about. Until next time, everybody take care. I'll talk to you later.